how do we find our way back to that sadness or that intuition that something's off or something's wrong, or to that, that alienation that we're feeling with a friend, and really just notice and hold space with a kind welcome for all these different thoughts and emotions and embodied sensations and more. I think that's the permission that I give, is how can we offer a kind welcome, because God does.
Welcome to Permission Slips, a space for you to practice paying attention to your life with self-compassion and kindness, so you can experience the wholeness, purpose, and joy you were made for. I'm Jillian DeBritz, a life and leadership coach and a recovering perfectionist, learning alongside you how to give myself permission to be human. I am so glad you're here with me today for this conversation with today's guest, my new friend, Chuck DeGroat. Chuck, thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'm glad we're friends.
I know, me too.
Yeah.
Chuck and I just met a few weeks ago at a retreat that he was speaking at. I happened to be at with my husband. It was a soul care retreat, and just such a joy. Having read your book earlier this year, Healing What's Within, which we'll talk about, it just felt like a really sweet gift to get to hear you speak from your heart about the content that I know you've labored over for years. So I want people to know, those who haven't read your book yet or don't know you yet, I want them to hear kind of what you do and where you're from. So
yeah.
Chuck is a professor of pastoral care and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, where he also serves as executive director of the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Program. He's an author, licensed therapist, church consultant, and spiritual director. He and his wife, Sarah, have 2 daughters, one of which you just said is in the counseling program that you oversee. How sweet is that?
Yeah, she and her husband both, and the youngest is thinking about it, so we'll see.
Yeah. Wow. I'm curious, Chuck, how did you get to this place professionally where you are? Can you give us kind of a brief overview of the journey to get here?
Yeah. Well, Henry Nouwen called himself a hyphenated priest psychologist, and I think I can borrow that, because that's what I've been really my whole ministry career, dating back to the mid-1990s. I often say, I'll make this really quick, but I was the guy who went to seminary with all the answers and thought I had it all figured out. And it took someone in my role, similar to the role that I have now, sitting with me and naming what they were experiencing with me and inviting me to go on a journey. And that was in 1997. And so I did my counseling studies alongside my Master of Divinity studies, and I got ordained and I got licensed and I went into ministry, and I was a pastor in Orlando and San Francisco, but I also started a couple of counseling centers. And so these things have sort of existed side by side over all these years.
Yeah, which really isn't that common, right? You hear a lot of pastors do some sort of lay counseling, but to have someone that actually is a licensed therapist and also has this pastoral heart, that's not necessarily a marriage of fields that we see all the time.
No.
Have you gotten pushback in that in any of your journey?
Yeah, earlier on I did, because there was a lot of skepticism about counseling. And yet at the same time, there were pastors that would secretly call me up and they'd be like, well, we trust you because you have your Master of Divinity. So, you're not just one of those therapists, So I haven't gotten as much pushback over the years. And in fact, I think it's just served churches that I've worked for very well. And then, I think even developing this clinical counseling program here at the seminary, it allows for a really good, I work at a really great place, the seminary that I'm at. The program that I went through years and years ago, there was the counseling program, and that's not theological, that's not, and it was us versus them, but that's not here at all. So there's this really beautiful, intersection, symbiosis, whatever word you want to use, integration. And I really feel supported, appreciated in that space.
Yeah, I love that. And I just think about my own journey and how healing it has been to understand how psychologically, physiologically, neurobiologically, God has designed my mind, body, heart, and
Yep.
soul to function together as one.
Yes.
And I
Yeah.
even think about, the greatest commandment Jesus tells us is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your
Yeah.
mind, all of your
Yeah.
soul, all of your strength. And so the sense of, oh, we're designed to be integrated. We're
Yeah.
designed not to have our spiritual life separate from our emotional health or even our
Yes.
physical health or our
Yeah.
relational health.
Yeah.
So I love that's part of your training and part of how
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
approach all of the work you do.
Yeah. So
Which
good.
speaking of your work and your journey, I told you when we met that a friend had actually told me about your book, Healing What's Within, your most
Mhm.
recent book. You have several. Um, this last spring, we were co-speaking at a women's retreat together, and she's like, "There's this amazing book I just read by Chuck
Mhm.
DeGroat. You have to read it. It would be such a cool framework for the retreat that we're speaking at." And so I read through your book and was just astounded by the vulnerability and
Yeah.
tender heart toward God and
Mhm.
toward yourself. This
Yeah.
this journey that you had been on. And you talk about inviting people on a compassionate journey inward to return and retune to the life God created we to
Mhm.
live. So I'm wondering, how did you learn to live this message in a way that made you want to write about it? 'Cause I
Yeah.
know so much of our writing, right, as anyone who
Yeah.
writes knows that this is
Yeah.
something we have to live first. So what
Yeah.
was that journey like for you to experience this message before you wanted to give it?
Yeah, that language of returning, retuning, the subtitle of the book, Coming Home to God, which is very Henry Nouwen-esque kind of
Mhm.
language. I think you can only talk like that if you've experienced, well, what the Bible talks about over and over again as being lost and found. You
Mm.
hear that in a number of the parables. And I mean, I think I wouldn't say it's because I got counseling training in the late 1990s and I
Yeah.
learned it when I was, in my late 20s. That was certainly a part of it, but I think it took an early trauma in ministry, being fired, which is where I start the book from. That was a really painful experience, and then not dealing with it very well. Putting my head
Mm.
down and just kind of grinding for the next 10 years before my body gave out at the age of 42. I mean, I tell the story of ending up in a hospital
Mm.
in Cabo, Mexico, of all places.
Mm.
And I needed emergency surgery, but even more than that, my system was septic. And like people who are 42, the systems are not supposed to be septic, but
Yeah.
that's the cost of living disconnected. So it's strange because I was living this life of this hybrid pastor therapist. I was leading spiritual retreats. I was even beginning to engage these questions that I engage in the book during that time and still living a pretty disconnected life.
Mm.
So that was, I hate that it takes wake up calls like that sometimes, and I think, it could have been far worse. It could have gone in a different direction, I suppose. But like that was a wake up call for me. And I ended up in the next year transitioning from my very favorite job and place that I've ever lived in some ways in San Francisco,
Mm.
California, and a place that I think in many ways, like used all of my gifts. And yet I knew I would need to go on this very intentional journey of, again, let's just keep talking about Henry now, and of downward mobility
Yeah.
in order to start to do some embodied work, that you just hinted at, nervous system work, brain work. My daughter, who's now in this counseling program, used to say, "Daddy's going to do brain retraining." I'd go off and I'd do body work, brain work, body scans, contemplative prayer in an attempt to sort of shift the state of my nervous system from perpetual, what I call sympathetic storm, or this
Mm.
hamster wheel of sympathetic storm and dorsal fog, like go, 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 shut down, go, 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 shut down, to more of a state of home, what I call home, this place of connection. But it's this story of lost and found that you see throughout scripture. I
Mhm.
just, I love that you call yourself a recovering perfectionist, because I kind of thought, well, who has it better than me? I have all the tools at 27 years old. I've got my counseling degree and my master of divinity. I've got it figured out. No, it blew up.
Yeah,
So yeah,
totally. Man, I so relate to that story, and I know that we haven't talked a ton about kind of where
yeah,
I come from, but my story is similar in a lot of ways in a different field. I was a high school teacher
mm,
before I took time to be a mom and then
mhm,
entered into coaching. But yeah, that sense of pushing, pushing, pushing through all of the warning signs
yeah,
in my body and in
yeah,
my emotions, and
yeah,
reaching that point where my body said, no more, no
mm,
more. You will now
mhm,
stop. And for
Uh-huh.
me, it became in the form of just a complete mental health implosion that
Yeah.
devastated my sense of identity, my faith. And I had to learn to pick up the pieces and discover who I was all along and who God was in the midst of it all. And that was one of the most excruciating journeys I've ever been on. That actually healed me and set me free from this huge, heavy, impossible weight of perfectionism that I continue to ask God to help me be
Mhm.
set free from.
Mhm.
But that
Yeah.
sense of disconnection and how we do live, and that constant tension between home and the things that take us away from who we're
Yeah.
made to be.
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of phrases that people may or may not be familiar with. You talked about this
Yeah.
symbiotic storm and this dorsal fog. Can you kind of talk about like
Yeah.
what happens in our nervous system when we're
Yeah.
going like you were?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, sometimes I simplify it like this. There's home, which is a place of connection, when you feel most like yourself. And we all
Yeah.
know that place, that maybe 2 days of every year we feel like ourselves.
Right.
I hope not.
Yeah.
In fact, I was just in a counseling session the hour before our time together, and I was simplifying this for a pastor who lives in what I call sympathetic storm, which is the gas pedal, which is your
Mm,
sympathetic nervous system. It's like you're pressing the gas down. You're in an episode of Fast and Furious each and every day. You get up, pick up your phone, check your email, you get in your car, you turn on the map, see if there's going to be traffic, get to work as quickly as you can. You're in it, that's that gas pedal, that sympathetic
mhm.
storm. But then your body sort of says, that's enough. This is just kind of too much. And you go into what we call the dorsal vagal system, a dorsal fog, the brake pedal. And you think that that's good, and in a way it's good, but what ends up happening is you get a bag of Cheetos and you sit on your couch for 5 hours and you check out, and your family says, "Hey, Dad, can you come out?" And you ignore them, and they come over and they wave in front of your face, and
Right.
you're just kind of catatonic at that point.
Right.
And a lot of us, I think, spend our lives on the hamster wheel of that sympathetic storm and that dorsal fog, or that gas and that brake. Go, 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 shut down. Go, 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 go. You know, spend the rest of your night drinking too much alcohol and streaming too many videos, and you fall asleep and you wake up and you do it all over again. And so, at least in the work that I do, part of it is like, how do I get off of that wild roller coaster, that hamster wheel that I'm on, whatever metaphor that you want to use, and find my way back to center, rooted and grounded in love, as Paul says in Ephesians 3. And can I live there? Now we can't live there perpetually, like in some Zen state, like all the time.
Right.
I wish, but because things happen. There are hard days. There's a tough meeting. There's the fight with your spouse. There's all the things, right? But do we have the resources to find our way home again? That's the big question, I think, for me these days.
Yeah, I love how you describe that. The reality of, yeah, we're not actually going to live in that state all the time because we are human in a world that is
Yeah.
coming at us from all sides.
Yeah.
But how do we return there more and more quickly and more
Yes.
frequently?
Yes.
And you mentioned a few things that your daughter called it your brain work, retraining your brain.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what are some of those things. Even as I ask this
Yeah.
question, I'm aware of the temptation to create another checklist of things
Mhm.
that we can do, especially you talked
Yeah.
about your journey being
Yeah.
in that spiritual leadership place
Yeah.
and also being disconnected from
Yeah.
yourself. There is that risk of, okay, here's some more things we can do that disconnect
Yeah.
us further.
Yeah.
But what are some of those things that you have found to be helpful in
Yeah.
returning home?
Yeah, there are so many resources, and we could spend probably an hour or two just talking about the many resources. I've got a friend named Audie Kolber who's written in this area, and she wrote a book recently called "Take What You Need." It's
Mm,
like, I love that phrase because it's like there are resources that help some people and don't help others. For me, I've been steeped in the Christian contemplative tradition for a long time, and I've appreciated contemplative prayer as a way of silencing what Martin Laird calls the cocktail party of the mind, and those become those have been practices for me. But when after the hospitalization and when we left San Francisco, I was trying all kinds of things. I ended up doing this program called dynamic neural retraining, that was really an embodied practice of shifting brain states. And that was helpful for a season, right? But I learned I learned various breathing techniques, because you realize that when you're living in sympathetic storm or on this hamster wheel, you don't breathe. You go through life kind of like this. And
Totally.
so finding your way back to your breath is a way of finding your way back to safety. It communicates to your body it's okay. Because when we're breathing naturally, our body is in that home state. When we're under threat, imagine like you're going through an intersection and a car is about to hit you. You're not breathing naturally at that point.
No.
I don't think, unless Jillian's like some sort of Zen master, but like, you're like, so, and a lot of us live in that state of like,
Yeah.
and so, breathing exercise. There's this fascinating book called Breath by James Nestor, where he walks through all these different kinds of practices of breathing. But I do this very basic pattern of 4, 7, 8 breathing, 4 seconds in, holding for 7, exhaling for 8. Embodied practices like bilateral tapping, the butterfly hug, and bilateral tapping. If I do this for a minute, almost inevitably, I will have this big sigh, like, so there are lots of practices that we've discovered nowadays that communicate to our bodies a sense of safety. In fact, I do this. All my clients know that Chuck is always doing this. Why does Chuck do this? That's not very masculine. There's a lot of people talking about.
For those that can't see, that are just listening, he's rubbing his
my
chest,
chest.
his heart.
Yeah, just like this soothing kind of posture. So there are lots of practices for recovering perfectionists like us, Jillian. There's not one way. We wish there was like some sort of recipe. Just do this thing. But the question would be, what invites safety for you? What invites you to a posture of safety and reconnection? And so if I have people I'm working with, and I know you do a lot of coaching, who appreciate contemplative prayer or a body scan, people have all kinds of different practices. It's like, just find your practice. And then, by the way, that practice probably evolves over time and changes because, you change. And so it looks a little bit different. Yeah. You know this, at the end of each chapter of Healing What's Within, I invite practices, anything from ancient prayers, breath prayers where we inhale and exhale, to more contemporary ways of engaging our nervous system.
Yeah. And that is such a great resource. I'm going to make sure to include a link so people can find Healing What's Within, because it really is just a really gentle, helpful, compassionate guide into some of this work. And you model vulnerability and share some of your clients' stories to help people envision what this might look like for themselves. And I'm aware of how this journey for me has transformed my spiritual life. Like, this has been a journey of, yes, I want to come back home to my body. I was someone who disconnected from my body my entire life for lots of reasons that make perfect sense for me in hindsight. And the practice of reconnecting with my body felt healing and foreign at the same time. But I'm curious, what's the connection in your experience and understanding with our embodied selves and our relationship with God, our spiritual lives? Like, how does one impact the other?
Yeah. Well, I mean, here again, it's in the beginning, it was already integral. We were nefesh in the Hebrew, embodied soul or ensouled body. There's really no way of talking about soul and body in the Hebrew that is disconnected. And so it's in the Christian tradition who have disconnected these things. I grew up in a part of the Christian tradition that was very disembodied. And, in fact, my dad would make fun of those people that raised their hands in worship, and moved in worship. God forbid we move, and so we were the frozen chosen, and that's what I learned. And I found my way back to parts of the Christian tradition where there are liturgical expressions, embodied postures, but it's been challenging. And so it almost feels unnatural because my body wasn't integral to my spiritual life growing up. No one talked about the body, right? In fact, it was like, don't trust your body. Don't trust the flesh. I mean, it's purity culture. It was, that'll get you in trouble. And what I've learned is that our bodily intuitions, our feelings lead us to God if we listen to them. And the scriptures reveal this over and over again. I do sort of a bit of a deep dive into Psalm 38 in one of the chapters of the book where, David is not just talking about his thoughts, but his emotions and his bodily sensations and his behaviors and his relationships. And it's like, all of it is brought before God with profound honesty. And one of the things I noticed was I just wasn't listening. In fact, I was practicing as a therapist. I was a pastor. I was leading spiritual retreats. And I landed in the hospital because I was not listening to my body's cues. My body
Wow.
was like shouting, stop. This is too much. You need to slow down. You're pushing too hard. You're not listening. And I just, in fact, before we left to go on that trip to Mexico, I wasn't feeling well. And I did what I always did. My wife said, should we go? Oh yeah, of course. I'm just gonna bring ibuprofen along and Tums along and start drinking midday to numb it,
Yeah.
And so
Right. Yeah.
I think that's what we do sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. That sense of if I can just deal with my body, then I can move on with my life. Like, let me just
Yeah.
numb what's happening here in the
Yes.
discomfort instead of paying attention to it and
Yeah.
asking what it actually needs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Man, that was such a healing part of my journey too.
Mm,
I think about, like, you were talking about David bringing the fullness of his experience to God.
mm,
And so much of my story had to do with believing, as a big feeler, believing my emotions were a liability, that they were a
mhm,
weakness. They were,
right.
revealed my instability and poor character and lack of
Yeah.
self-control. And especially even in my spiritual life, thinking, man, I just got to, take my thoughts captive, and I have to,
Mhm,
crucify my flesh, and all of these
mm,
things that are in scripture, and taking
yeah.
those out of context in a way that was very harmful to my overall health. And so
Yeah.
learning to honor, learning to really on an intellectual level, even learning about God's design for our emotions and
Yes.
the purpose of
Yeah.
them and the
Yeah.
integration and how our brains
Yeah.
neurobiologically are
Yeah.
wired to be
Yes.
integrated and whole. It created this kind of release of the pressure I felt to control everything about how my body functioned and
Mhm,
invite the fullness of my experience into my spiritual life, which,
mhm,
man, that
mhm,
changed everything. And there are a lot of people who might think that this type of internal work or paying attention to our bodies, paying attention to ourselves,
mhm.
is a form of like navel gazing,
Yeah.
that now we're looking at ourselves instead of looking to God. And it,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what our experience is. We just have to,
Yeah.
forget ourselves. What would you say to people who are resistant to this type of work because they don't want to become self-absorbed?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I used to get this pushback a lot more, particularly in ministry settings among pastors, it's therapeutic culture, it's navel gazing. And I would always go back to scripture. I would go back to the Psalms, search me and know me, O Lord. But then I'd go to maybe this is one of the advantages of having a master of divinity and having studied church history and being a little bit of a nerd in that area is that I'd say, but what about St. Augustine, who's called the father of interiority? Actually, that's not me saying that. That's the tradition saying that, the father of interiority, 9
Uh-huh.
chapters in his confessions, talking about his own life, his story, his addictions, his emotions. And then the beginning of chapter 10, let me know myself, O Lord, let me know you. Like there's something about knowing ourselves and knowing God that are intertwined. And I could tell lots of stories from the Christian tradition about this kind of interiority. And
Mhm.
so it's sometimes framed as if it began with those very bad therapists, who are all navel gazers. And I do think that there are those who do this work in a way that's so isolated. There's no there's no movement toward others. There's no movement toward God. That's why the subtitle of this book is Coming Home to Yourself, to Others, and to God. I don't know what the subtitle is, but it's something like
Yeah.
that.
Coming home to yourself and God when you're wounded, weary, and
Yeah, yeah,
wandering.
yeah. I mean, it's relational, right? It brings us back to God. It's about reconnecting to ourselves and to God. There's something about that honesty. I mean, I think this is the beauty of going back to the earlier parts of the Christian tradition, that in that honesty, we find our way back to God. In David's honesty in Psalm 38, he finds his way to God after a season of, in a sense, running from God in all kinds of different ways, right? And so, yeah, we hear that. I'm sure you hear that too, Jillian. Every
Mhm.
now and then it's navel gazing. Just stay focused on mission, stay focused on others. I think we've probably seen enough of the damage of that over the years. I mean, if you follow any of the stories in and around pastoral ministry, mission work, there are so many stories of women and men burning out, moral failures, all kinds of different things because they didn't attend to their souls and
Yeah.
bodies.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a beautiful and heart-wrenching warning of the value of paying attention. And I I love how you start healing what's within. in the garden. That's where you take us to this original design for connection with God and with
Mm,
ourselves and with one another, where part of my journey has been really learning to pay attention to shame and how
mm,
shame has
mm.
hijacked so much of my life and my mind and my
Yeah.
motivation, and trying to avoid shame at all costs. And
Mm,
so I love that, you bring us to this place where Adam and Eve are together in the garden, naked and unashamed,
mhm,
like in our original state of
mhm.
intended connection.
Yeah.
And then you talk about these questions that
Mhm.
God asks them in this
Yeah.
story as a framework for how we can connect with God, with ourselves, and with one
Yeah.
another. Can you talk about those questions a little
Yeah.
bit?
Yeah. Yeah. I just think it's so beautiful. I grew up in a tradition where it was like, the Bible starts with all the bad stuff. The Bible starts with sin. The Bible starts with tragedy. It starts at Genesis chapter 3. It's the fall. And I think the beautiful thing is that it starts in relationship. It starts in beauty. It
Mm,
starts in connection. It starts in longing. It starts in intimacy and delight and all the things, right? And it's a slithering serpent who comes into the scene in Genesis chapter 3 and targets Adam and Eve in a very specific way, as if to say, can you really trust God? Can you really trust God's image in you, how God designed you for worth and belonging and purpose? And it leaves Adam and Eve with questions, the kind of questions that you and I have. Maybe I can't trust God. Maybe I can't trust that God's design for me is good. Maybe I have to go it on my own. This is why this story is one that has been so powerful over the years for the church. And Adam and Eve do, in a sense, what you and I do each and every day. We grasp, we go it on our own. And what the beautiful thing about those questions is that what you find next is God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And you could almost hear the rustling leaves, right? And God is on the walk. What we're hearing here is God is on the walk that God would have taken with Adam and Eve each and every day. It's in the
mm,
cool of the day. It's in a time of the day when the sun wasn't so hot and when you go out on walks in the ancient Near East. And it's sort of like, oh, here it is. God is looking for Adam and Eve, his friends. Like, where are you? That's the first question, right? And it's, by the way, the same word in the Hebrew that is the first word of the book of Lamentations. It's a word of heartbreak, like God is missing his friends. Where are you? I'm heartbroken. I miss you. Who told you is the second question. Who's been whispering in your ear? Who whispered something so different than what I whispered over you, that you were designed in my image, that you were created for worth and belonging and purpose? Whose voice have you been listening to? And so already you begin to sense that these questions are really relevant for us today. Where are you in the midst of your disconnection, in the midst of your hamster wheel life, your
yeah.
sympathetic storms and dorsal fogs, your gas and your brake? Where are you, Jillian, when you're going at 100 miles an hour through your day?
Hmm.
Who told you? Who's whispering to you that you're not enough, that you're not worth it, that you're not lovable, that you don't belong, that you don't matter? And then the third question, and we talked about this at the retreat. This was one that initially puzzled me. Like, have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from? I was like, that's not a very open-ended, it's not a very good therapeutic question,
Right.
you
Come
know?
on, God.
And then I was listening to it years ago, and I was like, oh, I think God is really getting at, like, how are you coping? Where are you taking your hunger and thirst? Where are you going to self-medicate? The list is long for me, because in the absence, when I don't feel connected to God, when I'm sort of going it on my own, there are all kinds of ways that I'll numb and self-medicate. And a lot of them look really spiritual. They look really
Yeah.
holy. I'm in the religion business. I teach at a seminary, and so for goodness sakes, my busyness can look holy. So if a student
Mm,
comes to me and says, "I need some time with you," I'm too busy doing the work of the Lord to spend. Right?
right.
So it's like the third question is then presses into some invitation to confession. Like, how are
Mm,
we? How are we running from God? How are we grasping? How are we numbing? How are we self-medicating? But I think the heart behind these questions is so much kinder than I ever imagined. And
yeah.
again, I grew up in a tradition where it's kind of sounded like God was just really mad. Like, what the hell have you done? I hope I
Right.
can say that on this podcast.
It's
Um,
fair.
I just don't think that's the heart of God. And then, the proof of it is that God pursues throughout all of Scripture. We blow it time and time again, and God comes in the flesh in Jesus. God comes even closer in the spirit, and God will eventually make all things new, right? Like, God just
Yeah.
keeps pursuing.
Yeah. I love that storytelling that brings to life the interactions between God and Adam and Eve and his
Yeah.
questions. in a way that as I listen to your voice, I can't help but notice how little, actually, there's zero condemnation.
Mhm.
There's zero
Yeah.
shaming in your tone as you're asking the question. Because I've always read it in a similar tone as what you kind of
Yeah.
described as, where are you? What have you
Yes.
done? The
Yes.
sense of, who told you
Yes.
that? Like, how
Yes.
dare you believe that? How dare you
Yes.
disobey me? What's
Yes.
wrong with you? What's wrong with
Yes.
you? What's wrong with you? And there's such a shift that happens even in my body as I hear you
Yeah.
ask those questions in a
Mhm.
kind, condemnation-free tone.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder, what's important about compassion and
Mhm.
kindness as
Mhm.
we ask these questions, or imagine God
Yeah.
asking us those questions.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of changes, at some deep level how you view God. God, again, for a lot of us growing up, not everyone, I know, I hope my daughters have a much kinder view of God, right? I think for a lot of us, God is this sort of this angry old man in the sky, with arms
Mhm.
crossed and a big white beard and, stern eyes and a look of disappointment. And, that's a recipe for shame.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that there's a retraining. We were talking about brain retraining. I think that there is a kind of embodied retraining that needs to happen. I've done a lot of work in my own life with spiritual abuse. I've been working with spiritual abuse for almost 30 years now. And it's not like a theology check, like, let me just give you a little better theology, Jillian, and the shame will go away. You know this, right? Like, there's a beginning to trust that maybe God's heart is that kind. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book. And one of the things that I often say to people who've experienced spiritual abuse is like, take this slow because this might be a really hard book to read. And you might want to throw it against the wall because you might start to read these questions and think, there's no way there's any kindness here, not with the God that I experienced in my tradition, in the cult like Christianity I grew up with. So there's got to be a lot of patience, a lot of tenderness with ourselves as maybe this gets to your classic question about permission, like
Hmm.
permission to be wherever you are on the journey, even if you're kind of skeptical about God. Like, I have people at retreats like the one we just did that will come up to me and say, I can't believe that. There's just no way God can be that kind. And there are stories, if you look at scripture, there are stories that I think are often misunderstood. There are different ways of telling some of the stories, but there are stories where you'd be like, oh yeah, God does not seem very kind at all.
Yeah.
So it takes a lot of work, a lot of patience.
Right. Well, and I appreciate what you said about this not being like an intellectual exercise that we can just convince ourselves, oh,
Mhm.
believe God is kind and make that
Mhm.
change. Right. And
Mhm.
so I'm curious for you, what did that journey look like? And it's not something we can even do in isolation, I would argue, of retraining our minds to imagine a kinder view of God.
Yeah.
So, what did that look like for you? How did you actually
Yeah.
transition to seeing God that way?
This was where I began practicing contemplative prayer, but in my own way, in a kind of more imaginative way. There was a practice that I've been engaging for probably 15 years now, where and even as I start to say it, I think, gosh, some people are going to think this is so silly, but we all find our way to these kinds of beautiful places where we feel connected. Maybe it's a beach, maybe it's a clearing in the woods. Mine is a Scottish castle, and I
Mhm.
climbed the steps because I was almost going to do PhD work in St Andrews, Scotland, and to me, it's like this old Celtic kind of landscape, Celtic Christian landscape, and I'm climbing these castle steps, and I go through these doors, and there's Jesus smiling at me, saying, "Welcome." This has been a part of my contemplative practice for years and years, where I experience the kindness of Jesus. Now, there are some texts. In fact, I share some of them in Healing What's Within. Do not fear, I'm always with you. Nothing can separate you from my love. I've sat with words like that for years to attempt to retrain my body and brain to trust that God is just that kind. But it's seeing the smile of Jesus, wherever I am, whatever state I'm in, kind eyes.
Mhm.
This has been imaginative work. I don't think Christians use their imagination quite enough, right?
Yeah.
This kind of imaginative work that looks different for each and every one of us.
Mhm.
I know the movie The Shack was very controversial. I don't know the novel and then the movie The Shack. The novel was one thing. The movie had me almost sobbing, but this imagination of the Trinity holding space for someone in pain. There are things like this that if we could just use our imaginations, we can find our way to these places of kindness. So I often try to take people in an imaginative way back to Genesis 3, back to the rustling leaves, back to the kind eyes of God, back to the, where are you? I miss you. I'm out on our walk right now. I'd love to have you with me. That kind of way back into the story that is, again, it's hard for some of us who didn't grow up with a God quite like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that you mentioned the power of our imagination, because that's what's been transformative for me as well,
So,
is this sanctified imagination where I use my use my imagination to picture the most beautiful version of God interacting with me in the form of Jesus that I can, in a way that feels personal and real. And I believe that through the Holy Spirit, I believe that's him helping me picture him in a more accurate way. And it's interesting because I just had a conversation actually at the retreat we were at together. I can't remember if you were in the room when someone made this statement about, sometimes I worry that I'm imagining God the way I want him to be.
Yeah.
Is this just even imagining things that God would say to him?
Yeah.
Am I just making this up because it's what I want to hear?
Yeah.
And I have wrestled with that same question of like, am I just creating a God in my mind? And the truth is, I'm using people who I have encountered him in my imagination to form this picture. Sometimes when I can't picture Jesus, I picture my spiritual director or my counselor or my husband, and I borrow their faces and imagine Jesus with me.
Yes.
And so I've wrestled with the same idea of, am I just hoping that God is as kind as I want him to be? And it struck me one day, which again, I'm just going to assume that this is God himself, that I can never out imagine the kindness of God. I can never out imagine it because he's kinder than we can even comprehend or experience. He's more tender, more compassionate than even my most creative imagination of him. And so, and even, as you were talking, I was thinking about athletes too, and the power of that kind of visualization and how like it actually serves such a powerful purpose of preparing their bodies for competition. So I love that you brought that up.
Here's more permission. Become like a child, Jesus says, and because we adults take ourselves so seriously, we get very left-brained, right? We lose access to our right-brained imaginative cells. So become like a child. Children have all kinds of wild ideas about what God looks like, but there's so much permission to become like a child. And you in your spaces that you've engaged in over the years in retreats and coaching, like when you get to lead in spaces like this is really fun. I remember back in the day, I used to bring magazines. Maybe some of your listeners remember magazines. They're things that we would
They're made of
subscribe
paper.
to. Yeah. And to retreats, and people would cut things out in words and pictures and like create their imaginative kind of spaces. And it was so fun to see them engage in right brain ways, that where they began to sense maybe there is this permission to experience God. And scripture itself gives us all kinds of different metaphors and images of God. If you notice, like go from one book to another and it seems to like switch from one picture of God to another. And also imagery, I don't want to offend your listeners, but imagery that's very motherly and feminine. And even the prodigal son story is a picture of a father that's running and all the ancient Near Eastern work around that. Read the work of Kenneth Bailey, says that that's what a mother would do. And so kind of this mothering presence of God that's been really important in my own healing, to imagine God as this kind mother, right? So, wow, like there are just so many directions and so much permission. So, which is very appropriate to talk about on this particular podcast. So,
which I love that you keep bringing up permission. It makes me wonder, Chuck, as we kind of wrap up here, what permission slip, if any, would you want to give the people that are listening?
Well, I think we've already talked about a few, but maybe the permission slip, maybe a really simple one today would be to find your way to Psalm 38. permission to name all the things, feel all the feels, access what's going on in your body. Because some people are like, I just don't know. I mean, you and I have both sat with folks like this who are like, I just don't know. That's not, in my church, in my marriage, in my setting, it's not appropriate to, to pay attention to what's going on with me. I just need to serve. I just need to kind of submit. I just need to be obedient. I just need to. And I want to say, no, actually, I mean, I get that. But again, as you said earlier, I mean, we take some of these things wildly out of context. Yeah. And so how do we find our way back to that sadness or that intuition that something's off or something's wrong, or to that, that alienation that we're feeling with a friend, and really just notice and hold space with a kind welcome for all these different thoughts and emotions and embodied sensations and more. I think that's the permission that I give, is how can we offer a kind welcome, because God does.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Thank you, Chuck. This conversation has been so rich, and I know people are going to want to connect with you. So I'm wondering, where can people find you if they want to learn more?
Yeah. So my website is chuckdegroat.net, and that's where you'll find more about me and my family. And I got some video courses and things like that on there. And then on some of the social media places, at Chuck DeGroat, Substack is kind of where I've been hanging out more recently, because that's where you'll find a lot of really interesting writers and stuff like that. But Instagram and Facebook and X and others. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the gift of being with you today.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been really fun.
So good to be with you, Jillian.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Permission Slips podcast. I hope this conversation will give you permission to look bravely and honestly within, believing that, as Chuck writes, God's heart is always ready to help you find your way home. Remember, your life matters, and so does your journey toward healing, more than you know.